No one could have said it better. J.D. Vance exposed the false utopianism of the left when it comes to globalization at the American Dynamism Summit, and I think it sets the record straight for it's the American worker that has been on the losing end of a global race to the bottom for wage labor. Just take a look at this for yourself because there's so much I need to tell you about.
There were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. The first is assuming that we can separate the making of things from the design of things. The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. And yeah, some people might lose their jobs in manufacturing, but they could learn to design, or to use a very popular phrase, learn to code. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. There are network effects, as you all well understand. The firms that design products work with firms that manufacture. They share intellectual property, they share best practices, and they even sometimes share critical employees. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends.
And that was the fatal miscalculation over the last 40 years. We thought moving up the value chain into IP and tech design would be able to replace the heart of American manufacturing. In other words, we thought we could replace the Rust Belt with Silicon Valley. By the way, we've got some things in the pipeline you can't miss, so be sure to subscribe to Millionaire Mentor to be the first to see it. Now there's a problem. The decline of the American Rust Belt, which has been the engine of economic growth for decades, could not offload the weight of employment it was carrying onto a super high-skilled tech industry in the 21st century. Here's a statistical comparison. The US tech industry supports around 400 to 500,000 jobs, paying a lot of money but are few in number. Compare that to the manufacturing sector, which supported close to 20 million jobs 40 years ago, down to around 13 million, and you realize where the problem lies. While we moved up the value chain, it also shrank the number of jobs we could directly support, while also increasing the sheer economic inequality between the people with ideas versus those that brought them to life through manufacturing.
Cheap labor is fundamentally a crutch. And it's a crutch that inhibits innovation. I might even say that it's a drug that too many American firms got addicted to. Now, if you can make a product more cheaply, it's far too easy to do that rather than to innovate. And whether we were offshoring factories to cheap labor economies or importing cheap labor through our immigration system, cheap labor became the drug of Western economies. And I'd say that if you look in nearly every country from Canada to the UK that imported large amounts of cheap labor, you've seen productivity stagnate. I don't think that's not a total happenstance. I think that the connection is very direct. Now, one of the debates you hear on the minimum wage, for instance, is that increases in the minimum wage force firms to automate. So a higher wage at McDonald's means more kiosks. And whatever your views on the wisdom of the minimum wage, I'm not going to comment on that here. Companies innovating in the absence of cheap labor is a good thing. I think most of you are not worried about getting cheaper and cheaper labor. You're worried about innovating, about building new things, about the old formulation of technology is doing more with less. You guys are all trying to do more with less every single day. And so I'd ask my friends, both on the tech optimist side and on the populist side, not to see the failure of the logic of globalization as a failure of innovation. Indeed, I'd say that globalization's hunger for cheap labor is a problem precisely because it's been bad for innovation. Both our working people, our populists, and our innovators gathered here today have the same enemy. And the solution, I believe, is American innovation.
Here's what's crazier. When you look at how globalization created a race to the bottom for labor, you're reminded of Karl Marx's critique of capitalism when he said the capitalist pursuit of surplus labor would make the bourgeois simply squeeze wages rather than innovate and improve efficiencies. But it doesn't have to be this way because it's not the result of the free market per se, but because of unfair trade practices where we falsely think we're operating in a fair and free market. Take China, for example, where a bulk of our manufacturing is gone before this tariff war. They didn't risk increasing tariffs on US companies and products. They just made it extremely difficult to enter the market through other means. One of those ways that they knew benefited them was forcing US companies to partner up with local firms and to share technology and expertise if they wanted access to the Chinese market. These tech transfer requirements for the last 20 years have been cutting at the knee of the entire rationale of globalization, which believed intellectual property could be separated from getting our hands dirty in manufacturing. That is a large part of how China now is a proper competitor in commercial airline manufacturing, named COMAC, which is an industry that used to be dominated by Western giants like Boeing and Airbus. And that tech transfer is on top of the fact that the US already loses hundreds of billions of dollars directly and indirectly to Chinese IP theft and piracy the CCP refuses to rein in. It's all of that holistic and historical view that informs this shift in trade relations with the world, especially China.
Our capacity to create new innovation in the economy cannot be a race to the bottom. Now, America's not going to win the future by ditching child labor laws or paying our workers less than Chinese or Vietnamese laborers. We don't want that, and it's not on the table. We can only win by doing what we always did, protecting our workers and supporting our innovators and doing both of those things at the same time. And so, I want to talk a little specifics here. The Trump administration's great plan for staging the great American manufacturing comeback is simple. You're making interesting new things here in America? Great. Then we're going to cut your taxes, we're going to slash regulations, we're going to reduce the cost of energy so that you can build. Our goal is to incentivize investment in our own borders, in our own businesses, our own workers, and our own innovation. We don't want people seeking cheap labor. We want them investing and building right here in the United States of America.
And there's no time when that was needed more than it is now. Here's why. The rapid rise of the remote work culture that we saw after the pandemic woke up many tech companies to the realization that the world of virtual work isn't just populated by Americans, but by talented people from across the world who could do the same job for much less. This incentivized outsourcing in industries wherever that was possible, even in sectors you wouldn't see coming, like some restaurants in New York that now hire virtual staff and virtual cashiers from the Philippines for as low as $3 an hour, skirting local labor and minimum wage laws. This is a trend that has left the American worker out in the cold.
The fundamental goal of President Trump's economic policy is, I think, to undo 40 years of failed economic policy in this country. For far too long, we got addicted to cheap labor, both overseas and by importing it into our own country, and we got lazy. We overregulated our industries instead of supporting them. We overtaxed our innovators instead of making it easier for them to build their great companies. And we made it way too hard to build things and invest things in the United States of America. That stopped 2 months ago, and it will continue to stop, and will continue to fight for American workers and the American businesses that hire them and that support them.
And perhaps that's the reverse gear on decades of past policy that the American working class voted for in this election. What remains to be seen is whether the reshoring of manufacturing really does undo the damage while also retraining the right incentive structures for America to keep moving further up the value chain. Let me know in the comments what you think about this, because it's still too early to tell whether that is the direction that we're moving in. Thanks for watching.